On October 24th, 2002, the nation's attention was focused on Washington, D.C. In the nation's capital and in neighboring suburbs, 10 people had been killed in sniper shootings which targeted people doing everyday things, like pumping gas, mowing lawns, and shopping. Once the snipers were captured, the tragedy was over and everybody could breathe a sigh of relief. However, the next day, just 11 days before Election Day, the nation would be hit with yet another tragedy.
This is an ABC News special report.
Good afternoon, everybody. We interrupt your regular programming to tell you of a plane crash in northeastern Minnesota, where we have just had confirmed a short while ago 8 people were killed on a small beach aircraft that was on its way to Eveleth, Minnesota, including Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota. And according to the senior staff in the senator's office, not only the senator, but his wife Sheila, his daughter, 3 members of his staff, and the 2 pilots.
Wellstone was to attend a fundraiser that afternoon held by former Vice President Walter Mondale and fellow Senate colleague Ted Kennedy in Minneapolis, but instead decided to attend the funeral of a friend's father. Later that night, he was to debate his Republican opponent, Norm Coleman, at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth. This was just 2 years after another Democratic candidate for Senate, Mel Carnahan, died 3 weeks before the 2000 election, which I have already made a video about. In this video, we are going to look at the electoral history of Paul Wellstone. We'll start with his early life and activism, then look at his 1982 run for Minnesota State Auditor, and then his 3 campaigns for Senate in 1990, 1996, and 2002. Hello, my name is Dave, and welcome to Election History. I have a master's degree from McGill University in political science and worked in politics for over 30 years. If you like videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the like, please subscribe to the channel and click the little bell so that you're notified of new videos. If you want to help out and support real independent historical research on these topics, please join my Patreon with a link in the description below. You can also do a one-time donation with the little thanks button below the video. Again, thank you all for your support. Now, on to the video. Born in Washington, D.C., Paul Wellstone attended the University of North Carolina on a wrestling scholarship in 1962. During his time at North Carolina, he was a dominant wrestler, where in 1963 he was undefeated in the 123 class, being the best wrestler in the entire Atlantic Coast Conference, as well as being the record holder at the University of North Carolina. Also late in 1963, he would marry Sheila Joyce Eisen on August 24th. But after his sophomore season, it seems as if Wellstone left wrestling to focus on his studies, though he was still a judge for local wrestling events around Chapel Hill. In 2000, Wellstone would be inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma. By the late 1960s, Wellstone was starting to show his progressive side. In the April 11th, 1968 Daily Tar Heel, which was the University of North Carolina's independent student newspaper, Wellstone, along with 3 others, had an editorial published speaking against racial discrimination. Wellstone's 1969 PhD dissertation, titled Black Militants in the Ghetto, Why They Believe in Violence, was an attitudinal study looking at why some people in the Black communities decide to take up violence to achieve their goals. I've linked the introduction to the methodology of Wellstone's dissertation below. After graduating from UNC, Wellstone took a position at Carleton College as a political science professor. However, having a tenure-track position didn't stop him from his activism. On May 7, 1970, 89 people, including Wellstone, were arrested for a sit-in in front of the federal building in Minneapolis to protest the Vietnam War. After Wellstone was arrested, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office gave Wellstone's information to the FBI, where they started a file on him. By 1977, Wellstone started expanding beyond issues of race in the Vietnam War, which had finished by now. He wrote about how utility companies were ignoring the wishes of rural Minnesota farmers by building power lines through their fields and over their houses without their consent. In 1978, his book titled How the Rural People Got the Power, A Narrative of a Grassroots Organizer, talks about his time in rural west central Minnesota regarding the Powerline issue, as well as other issues facing rural communities. In fact, Wellstone's first political connection to the Democratic Farmer Labor Party was through the Powerline issue, when he seconded the nomination of Alice Tripp for governor, who was also an advocate against the power lines through rural Minnesota. Tripp lost the endorsement of the DFL by a vote of 935 to 207 to incumbent Governor Rudy Perpich, and would lose the primary with only 20% of the vote. Perpich would go on to lose the general election in November. Still, Wellstone was far from being part of the Democratic establishment. In 1980, Wellstone would publish Powerline, the First Battle of America's Energy War, a book which discusses the battle to stop power line development in rural Minnesota. On top of his Powerline work, he also wrote an article in the New Republic about the need for textile workers to unionize, stating that less than 10% of textile workers were unionized and are, quote, unable to secure working wages, which makes them the lowest paid industrial workers in the nation, with an average hourly wage of $3.46 in November of 1975, end of quote. Even though he was showing his liberal credentials, the Powerline issue, as well as the books he had written about that issue, started making him a known commodity in both Democratic political circles as well as the voters in Minnesota, especially in rural communities. But as he spoke at events throughout the state, his message expanded beyond just the Powerline issue. He started talking about cuts that the Reagan administration was making on social programs, the nuclear arms race, pollution, as well as the issues of race that he spoke about when he was at UNC. With this, he decided to take the plunge into electoral politics and announced that he was running for Minnesota State Auditor on March 10, 1982. When Wellstone made his announcement, he stated that his focus was on creating jobs in the alternative energy sector, as well as continuing to fight against large utility companies to protect rural farmers. But he wasn't the only Democratic candidate. Now, before we get into the other candidates, there has been a tradition in Minnesota Democratic Party politics that the party endorses candidates in the primary. Even though the party endorses someone, the other candidates can still run in the upcoming primary. However, most of those candidates lose badly, as was shown with Alice Tripp's run for governor in 1978. Paul Wellstone was by far the most well-known candidate in the field. Almost immediately, Wellstone started picking up Democratic endorsements. First, the Progressive DFL caucus endorsed Wellstone on May 16th. 2 days later, the Southwest chapter of the DFL also endorsed Wellstone. He would also be endorsed by the Steelworkers Local 1938. Another candidate running for the Democratic nomination was David Farmer, a payroll manager from Maplewood, who also ran for auditor and lost in the primary to incumbent Bob Matson Jr. in 1978, who would eventually lose to Arne Carlson, who would later become a two-term governor of Minnesota. Jerry Coughlin, the owner of a Brooklyn Park insurance agency, was the third candidate. He was the endorsed DFL candidate for the 3rd Congressional District in 1976, but would lose to Bill Frenzel by a 2-to-1 margin. The final candidate was Dick Franson, the former 12th Ward alderman from Minneapolis and frequent candidate who ran as both a Democrat and Republican in the past. By the time of his death in 2015, Franson had run for 30 offices, both local and statewide. By the time the Democratic endorsement came along, Wellstone was in a strong position and won the endorsement of the state party by a voice vote, with the other candidates withdrawing their name from consideration. Coughlin said that he thought that the delegates to the convention didn't know any of the other 3 candidates. As for Franson, he was intentionally left off the ballot by party chair Michael Hatch. Franson said that he would boycott the DFL convention and still run in the DFL primary. As for Hatch, he said that he was unaware that Franson was even running for the position, even though it was pretty well documented in the newspaper accounts at the time. In the end of the day, Franson didn't run for state auditor and instead ran for the 1st District of the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners. Wellstone's general election opponent was incumbent auditor Arne Carlson, who in the past was a member of the Minneapolis City Council as well as the independent Republican candidate for Minneapolis mayor in 1967. He ran and won a seat in the Minnesota House of Representatives in 1970, in which he served until he won the auditor's position in 1978. The campaign immediately started after the endorsement, with Wellstone going on a 2-day, 8-city tour with other DFL-endorsed candidates. Of course, it wasn't easy for Wellstone, as he was criticized for not having any experience or qualifications for the position. But according to Rochester's Post-Bulletin newspaper, Wellstone, quote, was endorsed by the party even though he has no qualifications for the job. But judging by recent voting patterns, Minnesotans don't really care about that, and Wellstone makes a great stump speech, end of quote. Lou Hudson, a regional writer for the Worthington Daily Globe, said that Wellstone's personality and oratory rivals that of a young Hubert Humphrey. But even with that, those within the party criticized Wellstone's approach to campaigning. Robert Lachaume, the former secretary of the 4th District DFL, said, quote, I think if people really listened to him, they would be frightened by him, end of quote. But others, such as Dick Hansen, Minnesota member of the Democratic National Committee, positively said that Wellstone was forcing Democrats to start looking at moneyed interest, saying, quote, I think Paul being on the ticket is forcing those people to have to deal with those issues, end of quote. Former Democratic opponent David Farmer said that he thought that Wellstone was embarrassing to other Democrats running for office. So, what were some of those issues? Well, he advocated for tapping into public employee pension funds to provide money for low-interest loans for farmers and small businesses. He also supported the creation of a state bank which would provide alternatives to private banks. And he also supported requiring companies who plan to leave Minnesota to give their employees a year's notice and possibly allow the employees themselves to take over the operations. Wellstone even called for a new farm revolution, similar to what happened in the 1930s during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. He would later say that he should have used the word protest instead of revolution. This lack of experience, as well as deep connections in political circles, provided some major obstacles for Wellstone. The Minnesota AFL-CIO's Political Action Committee, the Committee on Political Education, or COPE, voted 16-10 for Carlson to be the endorsed candidate over Wellstone, though the committee endorsed all of the other Democratic candidates seeking statewide office. Still, he did pick up the endorsement of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Minnesota branch. Even with ASCME's endorsement, Wellstone had only raised $8,700 to Carlson's $50,000 at that point. By the end of the campaign, Wellstone will have spent $61,868, while Carlson will have spent $82,950. The first debate between Wellstone and Carlson was held on August 25th. At the end of the debate, Carlson dropped a bombshell when he released witness testimony that Wellstone gave in 1979 in a case regarding the Northern States Power Company rate hike. According to the testimonial document, Wellstone said that he had a disability that made it difficult for him to deal with mathematics, saying, quote, I have 3 children, and when all of them were young, one of the real tough times for me to go through was the fact that I couldn't put together an 8-piece puzzle for them. That is a disability I have. I can't read graphs or charts and figures very well at all. End of quote. After Carlson read the testimony, Carlson said, now, the whole office of state auditor revolves around graphs and charts and figures. That's the basis of our operation. It's kind of like a surgeon saying that I want to be a great surgeon, I want to perform surgery on you, but I really don't stand the sight of blood. End of quote. This would hurt a few days later, as the Minnesota Education Association would not endorse a candidate in the auditor's race. But to many voters, this looked more like mudslinging and an attack on Wellstone's character. A few days later, Wellstone wrote to a number of papers to give his side of the story. In his editorial, he stated that he had overcome his issues, that he received a PhD at the age of 24 and was a college professor. He also stated, quote, I will continue to stand proudly with the thousands of individuals who have overcome a learning problem and find themselves stronger for it. This list includes Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, and Woodrow Wilson, to name a few. End of quote. Still, a few weeks later, the AFL-CIO body itself would endorse Wellstone. The previous endorsement was done by the union's Political Action Committee, but this was a vote by the actual union, not just 26 people. As a response, Carlson tries to pivot the election a few days later, saying that Wellstone, who who had been talking about nuclear disarmament, shouldn't be focusing on national issues. Wellstone responds by attacking Carlson for creating an audit program without the approval of the Minnesota legislature as a, quote, hidden and wasteful expense, end of quote. He also stated that the job of the auditor shouldn't just be to examine the books, but to be involved with advocating for small businesses in local communities. By the end of the campaign, Wellstone was not the outsider anymore and becoming more a part of the Democrats' messaging. His progressive message was starting to become popular within Democratic circles. This led to Wellstone and gubernatorial candidate Rudy Perpich to jointly release a jobs program plan a few weeks before Election Day, with Perpich calling Wellstone, quote, a very, very, very good friend of mine, end of quote. As the campaign was winding down, Wellstone became more known as well as more popular. However, the major newspapers endorsed Carlson. But this criticism towards Wellstone wasn't about his approach to campaigning, but that the issues that he seemed to care about the most were not the issues that could be solved by the state auditor. With the Star Tribune saying, quote, Wellstone has chosen the wrong forum to make this case. If he were elected, it's unlikely that he could have much effect on such matters, end of quote. In the end, Carlson won 54.8% of the vote to Wellstone's 45.2%. After Wellstone's defeat, he went back to what he had done before, particularly when it came to talking about the plight of farmers and poor rural communities, saying that, quote, the right to farm is your right to life, end of quote. But he was also highly involved with the state Democratic Party itself, and give credit where credit is due. Nowadays, the Democratic Party sometimes refuses to support their own candidates, even if their chances of winning are probable. The Minnesota Democrats stuck with Wellstone through thick and thin and had his back, even after his loss. So a lot has to be said for the Minnesota Democrats after 1982. In August of 1983, Wellstone was hired by Governor Rudy Perpich as an energy advisor, a role in which he would travel the state and make people aware about energy conservation and alternatives, as well as establishing local councils to deal with energy issues, especially when it comes to coordination between local, state, and federal programs for energy conservation. But even with these new responsibilities, Wellstone continued to advocate for other issues, such as calling for a formation of a grassroots organization to deal with nuclear disarmament and attacking the Reagan administration's assault on food assistance. In August of 1984, Wellstone would eventually leave his advisor position and return to Carleton College to teach. At the same time, he was also elected to the Democratic National Committee the same year that Minnesotan Walter Mondale was running for the presidency. But no longer shackled with the restraints of government, Wellstone could be more politically active. In August, Wellstone was arrested along with Alice Tripp when a family farm in Stearns County was being taken away by banks. Over the next few years, Wellstone was one of the leaders of the Groundswell movement, a rural coalition working to prevent foreclosures on Minnesota farms. His continued work with farmers increased his statewide public profile even further. With that, Wellstone decided to take another crack at the state auditor position in 1986, making his announcement on March 21st. Arne Carlson decided to run for governor, making the position open. However, with Carlson abandoning his gubernatorial ambitions and running for auditor for a third term, as well as Wellstone's mother being ill, he dropped out a little over a month later on April 29th. After dropping out, Wellstone created a movement called the Minnesota 33% Campaign, which sought to contact 30,000 low-income voters to tell them about the importance of voting. In December of 1987, Wellstone was named the co-chair of the Jesse Jackson campaign in Minnesota along with Representative Karen Clark. And during 1988, he spent most of his time on the Jackson campaign, with Jackson finishing second in the Minnesota caucuses. Later, he ended up being the person who brought together the Dukakis and Jackson campaigns in Minnesota to deliver to the state for the Massachusetts governor. This also gave him more of a profile, especially at the national level, even though he had been a member of the DNC for a few years now. In January of 1989, Wellstone was already being considered a candidate for the U.S. Senate and had indicated in interviews that he was interested in running. And on April 4th, Wellstone made it official he was going to run against incumbent Republican Senator Rudy Boschwitz. Wellstone was the first Democratic candidate to enter the race, but some Democrats were worried. Minnesota Governor Rudy Perpich, who called Wellstone a very, very, very good friend of mine, encouraged former Vice President Walter Mondale to enter the race. Even if Mondale were to have entered the race, Wellstone said that he would not have dropped out. In fact, when reporting on Mondale, newspapers either failed to mention or reluctantly mentioned that Wellstone was even a candidate for the position. Still, on May 25, 1989, Mondale announced that he would not seek a return to the U.S. Senate and announced that he would retire from politics. One of the worries that Democrats had was that Wellstone might have a problem raising money. Those problems became compounded on June 9th when Wellstone announced that his campaign would limit campaign contributions to $5 and would not take any PAC money. In mid-1989, his campaign only had one worker, Kristen Blake, who was his campaign manager. Wellstone's progressive positions also worried Democrats, like State Senator Douglas Johnson, who himself was being considered a candidate for the position, saying that the Democrats needed a more moderate candidate. Still, as others waited, Wellstone was able to start getting support from a number of prominent local Democrats and members of the Minnesota legislature. While the Democrats were trying to decide what they wanted to do, Republican incumbent Rudy Boschwitz poked fun at Wellstone's campaign account. While Boschwitz had already raised $1.7 million, Wellstone had only raised $1,400. However, this criticism of Wellstone actually backfired as Boschwitz came across as thinking that he was a shoo-in for the seat. With the Brainerd Dispatch editorializing, quote, "It's not fair that Paul Wellstone be considered insignificant simply because he's not rich," end of quote. In a Star Tribune KSTP TV poll conducted in October, only 13% of those in the state recognized Paul Wellstone's name, while Rudy Boschwitz had an approval rating of 70%. Wellstone's campaign got a bit of a boost in August when the DFL State Committee conducted a straw poll and found that most of the committee supported Wellstone as the candidate, even though he only polled at 27.8%. Wellstone was still the only officially announced candidate, but that wouldn't last for long as State Representative Todd Otis announced that he was entering the race on September 10, 1989. On November 1st, former U.S. Attorney Tom Berg entered the race. A fourth candidate, Commissioner of Agriculture Jim Nichols, entered the race on November 20th. Fast forward to 1990, and on February 2nd, Otis drops out of the race, saying that the Democrats had a, quote, defeatist attitude toward beating Boschwitz, end of quote. Ironically, he would eventually be elected as the new Democratic Party chair in June. Still, the benefactor of Otis leaving the race was Wellstone, with several state legislators switching over from Otis to Wellstone. But even with the legislative support increasing, people in Minnesota still didn't really know who Paul Wellstone was. Another Star Tribune KSTP poll done from February 10th to 18th found that only 17% of the people knew who Paul Wellstone was, compared to 24% for Berg and 35% for Nichols. In addition, Wellstone, though many didn't know him, also had the highest unfavorable rating. Rudy Boschwitz was known by 98% of respondents and still had a 78% approval rating. But in a primary matchup poll, Wellstone was significantly behind. Jim Nichols was leading with 20%, with Berg at 14%, and Wellstone significantly behind at 6%. Not only did it seem like Wellstone wasn't going to beat Boschwitz, but that he wasn't even going to make it out of the Democratic primary. In the 1990 DFL Central Committee straw poll conducted in early March, Berg won with 39.7% support, with Wellstone not far behind at 38.3% and Jim Nichols at 7.6%. This becomes important for Wellstone as these votes are votes for the DFL's endorsement, which will give the candidate who wins that endorsement a big boost going into the primary, even if they have a primary opponent. Still, there was a movement against Wellstone if he were to get the nomination, with Congressman Tim Penny rumored to be entering the race if Wellstone won the DFL endorsement. Even on the eve of the DFL endorsement, which was in June, Wellstone's name recognition was still only at 20% throughout the state. But for the endorsement, that didn't matter. Another Star Tribune poll sampled delegates at the convention, and 39% supported Wellstone, with 30% for Tom Berg and 23% for Jim Nichols. This was the poll that mattered, at least to this point. On June 8th, delegates to the Democratic Convention picked Paul Wellstone as their endorsed candidate, which went to 6 ballots, where on the final ballot, Wellstone received 64.4% of the vote to Nichols' 32.4%, thus securing the endorsement. But Nichols decided to run in the primary anyway, with Berg deciding against it. The biggest area of difference between Nichols and Wellstone was abortion. Jim Nichols was pro-life, with the DFL's pro-life caucus endorsing his candidacy. As for Wellstone, he supported public funding for abortions, as he called the banning of federal funds for abortions an attack against the poor who cannot afford to proceed and are forced to have children that would be hard to support. 2 weeks before the DFL primary and just 2 months before the general election, another Star Tribune KSTP poll showed that 28% of potential voters in the primary would vote for Nichols, while 27% would vote for Wellstone. The poll also showed that Boschwitz would beat Wellstone 52% to 33%, with only 49% of the people in Minnesota even knowing who Wellstone was. A further breakdown of the poll showed that Nichols was doing better among poor conservative Democrats with little education, while Wellstone was doing better with college-educated liberals with higher income brackets. The poll was conducted between August 12th and 20th and released on August 25th. And then came the ad, or at least the first ad. Now, there are very few political ads that can change the course of a campaign, but Wellstone's fast-paced Paul ad did just that. I'm going to run that for you right now.
Hi, I'm Paul Wellstone, and I'm running for the United States Senate from Minnesota. Unlike my opponent, I don't have $6 million, so I'm going to have to talk fast. This is my wife, Sheila, and our children. This is my house in Northville, where I've lived for 21 years. My son, David, farms, and I've worked with Minnesota farmers for years. We must stop the poisoning of the air and the land and the water. I'll lead the fight for national health care. I've been a teacher for 24 years. Labor indoors.
Paul Wellstone won't slow down after he's elected. Vote for Paul Wellstone on November 6th.
Most of the media said that it was an interesting ad and they didn't know how it would play. As far as the Boschwitz campaign, Press Secretary Jay Novak said, quote, "When you're behind in a poll, and particularly your primary opponents, that's when you throw your Hail Mary passes." End of quote. Wellstone dominated the primary, winning 60.4% of the vote to Nichols' 34.5%. There was a third candidate, Gene Schenk, who won 5.2%. Nichols endorsed Wellstone on the night of the primary. Now, with less than 2 months ago, it was Paul Wellstone versus Rudy Boschwitz in the general. Also, with the results vastly different from the poll, people started questioning whether the polls could be trusted, including Jim Klobuchar, a writer for the Tribune. And yes, that's Amy Klobuchar's father. Even with that, a poll 6 weeks out from Election Day showed Boschwitz with a 15-point lead over Wellstone, with 55% for Boschwitz and 40% for Wellstone. Now, looking at Boschwitz, his campaign starts running ads that make him look significantly more liberal than he actually is, even being criticized by the press. The ads even go as far as saying that Wellstone would drastically cut Social Security. As for Wellstone, he was still running the same ad. As far as issues, Wellstone didn't change and didn't moderate his campaign message for the general election. He continued to talk about racism, the poor, protecting the environment, and universal health care. Another issue that came up during the campaign was the debates. In mid-September, the DFL proposed to have 6 joint farm debates throughout the state, which the Republicans rejected immediately. The reason why was because the debates would be jointly conducted with both the gubernatorial and senatorial candidates. The Republicans wanted to have the candidates for each office negotiate so that the Senate candidates would only negotiate with each other, not with the parties themselves. Going into the last month of the campaign, the focus started to be on money. Boschwitz and his campaign continued to brag that they were leading in the money race, which was true, having outraised Wellstone 15-1. Along with Boschwitz feeling as if he had the thing already won, it started to come across as arrogant. But the other thing was the debates, which Boschwitz did not want to participate in. As a result, the Wellstone campaign produced another ad. To me, this is the best political ad of all time. Here you go.
When I decided to run for Senate, there was one thing I was looking forward to. So as it turns out, were a lot of you.
Well, I expect that there will be some debates.
I'd love to see you debate with him.
Well, I think there should be debates, yeah.
Some people have more money than others to play with, and where if you debate, you're kind of standing there without money.
Getting a hold of the person I had to debate, however, proved easier said than done.
Is Rudy Boschwitz here? No, he's not.
You don't want me to go in?
No, we don't like strangers walking around.
First, I tried his campaign headquarters.
Let me give you my home phone number, too, okay?
Sure. I'll make sure that he gets this, and we'll get back to you.
What do you think? Do you think we should have debates around the state? So that people can
I'll get
see
the
it.
message to him.
What do you think?
Glad to meet you.
No,
Thanks
but about
thanks
these
for-
debates.
Thanks for coming down. I'll make sure he gets your message.
all
Thank
right,
you.
I'll see you all. Nice car. Then I tried his office. Is he here?
He is not here. He is returning from Milwaukee.
No luck. I'll write my home phone, too.
Sure.
Is this your pen?
I'm not sure. Probably not.
Looks like a nice one. Well, I don't have a lot of money, so I'll keep this one for our campaign.
That will be fine.
I tried everything. I mean everything. Rudy Boschwitz here.
No, not today.
Did Rudy Boschwitz call? Did anybody get a call from him? Well, if he calls, everybody, let me know. Hey, you guys? Okay, well, maybe I can find him somewhere then. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye. They say he's in the cities. I don't know where he is. He's not in Minneapolis. They say he's campaigning, then I go to St. Paul. They say he's in Milwaukee. Rest assured there will be debates on the key issues of this campaign. Look for upcoming dates and places. And in the meantime, if you see a silver-haired gentleman in a plaid shirt, mention I'm looking for him. Yes, information. Do you have the telephone number of a Rudy Boschwitz, please, in Plymouth?
And the ad worked, and Boschwitz agreed to debate. In a poll that was done the days before the debate, Boschwitz had grown his lead, now polling at 56% to Wellstone's 38%. On October 14th, which was a Sunday, the candidates had their first televised debate, which I will link in the description below. During the debate, Wellstone attacked Boschwitz for spending all of his time in Washington and saying that the senator didn't know the needs of average Minnesotans. He also talked about that when Boschwitz does travel to Minnesota, he doesn't listen to the voters, saying, quote, "You travel in Minnesota, but I just don't think you understand what's happening," end of quote. However, most of the debate was on foreign policy with the focus on the situation in Kuwait, which had just been invaded by Iraq. A few days later, on October 18th, both candidates engaged in a Minnesota public radio debate in which economic issues were front and center, with Wellstone talking about raising the top tax rate from 28% to 33%, as well as a number of other progressive views. 3 days after the debate, the state's largest newspaper, the Star Tribune, endorsed Wellstone for the U.S. Senate. In their endorsement, the paper said, quote, "If Minnesotans want to send to Washington a senator who in the years ahead would reflect their best instincts, one who would fight hard to instill those ideas in federal law and policy, they will elect Democratic candidate Paul Wellstone," end of quote. For Wellstone, the polls had turned as well. In a Star Tribune poll conducted the 19th to 21st, Wellstone was now at 45% to Boschwitz's 48%, within the poll's 4% margin of error. Interestingly, the poll showed that Boschwitz was doing better with younger voters, with Wellstone doing better with middle-aged and older voters. Like the primary, higher-income college graduates were more likely to support Wellstone. As far as geographical distribution, Wellstone was winning the 7-county metro area 50% to 44%, with Boschwitz winning in rural Minnesota. In the dying weeks of the campaign, Wellstone was hitting Boschwitz on every issue, and his voting record as well. Also, in an interesting twist, Wellstone was now going after Boschwitz for leaving D.C. and not voting on key issues. With these attacks, Boschwitz was getting desperate and decided to go on the attack, attacking Wellstone for getting himself arrested at a farmers' protest back in the 1980s. But this attack was, as the Star Tribune would say, quote, "an emergency mission with his standing in the polls eroding, anti-incumbent sentiment growing, and his party in complete disarray over the turmoil of John Grunseth's gubernatorial candidacy," end of quote. Grunseth was the Republican nominee for governor and had a number of disgusting scandals. I mean, I usually don't mind mentioning these scandals, but just go ahead and Google search it because this is one completely and utterly disgusting thing, and I want to keep it out of this video. In a KARE-KBJR poll conducted just a few days before the election, Boschwitz only led Wellstone by 1%, 44% to 43%. But another poll by WCCO-TV and the St. Paul Pioneer Press showed Boschwitz up by 9%, leading 49 to 40. The Last Star Tribune poll also confirmed the WCCO poll, now showing Boschwitz with a 51 to 42% lead over Wellstone. None of the polls leading up to Election Day ever had Wellstone in the lead. In fact, the only political poll that ever had been conducted showing Wellstone in the lead for anything was the delegate poll for the endorsement back in June. Even the primary polls showed Wellstone losing to Nichols. But just before Election Day, Boschwitz sent out a letter to the Jewish community saying that Boschwitz was a better Jew than Wellstone. The letter, written by Ruth and Alan Aaron of Minnetonka, said, quote, "Wellstone has no connection with the Jewish community or our communal life. His children were brought up as non-Jews. He represents a disturbing element in American politics." End of quote. While this letter angered the Jewish community, it really made the Boschwitz campaign look desperate and mean-spirited. On election night, when asked about the letter, Wellstone said that he felt that it didn't help Boschwitz. Many argue that this was the tipping point of the campaign. And on election night, Paul Wellstone won the U.S. Senate race in Minnesota, with 50.5% of the vote to Boschwitz's 47.9%. Interestingly, in the governor's race, incumbent Rudy Perpich lost to the Republican challenger, but it wasn't Grunseth. At the last minute, Grunseth was replaced by none other than Arne Carlson, Wellstone's old nemesis from 1982, winning the first of 2 terms as Minnesota governor. As for Wellstone, he said that he was going to limit himself to 2 terms. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos, this channel is about elections and not legislation. But during Wellstone's first term, he voted against the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq as well as NAFTA. On the domestic front, he voted for the Family and Medical Leave Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Brady Bill, and the assault weapons ban. Therefore, he was consistent with being a progressive in the Senate. One of the only conservative votes that he cast was for the Defense of Marriage Act, in which he would later question his votes, especially after the brutal death of Matthew Shepard. Still, he was a progressive, introducing the American Health Security Act of 1993 bill, which would have implemented universal single-payer healthcare in the United States, with Vermont Representative Bernie Sanders co-sponsoring the House version of the bill. With that, let's jump into the 1996 U.S. Senate campaign. Early in 1995, Rudy Boschwitz was hinting at another run for his old Senate seat, with filing his statement of candidacy with the Federal Elections Commission on January 31, 1995. However, he didn't officially kick off his campaign until April 19, 1996. Unlike other campaigns where we delve deep into the Democratic primary, we aren't going to do that here. Wellstone obviously received the party's endorsement and won the Democratic Party primary with 86.4% of the vote against token opposition, with Dick Franson, who we talked about in 1982, finishing second with 7.3% of the vote. When it came to campaign messaging, Wellstone didn't change, mostly because he had the record to back up what he had always been saying for years. As for Boschwitz, he flipped. In 1990, he tried to make his record seem more liberal than it actually was. But between then and 1996, the Republican Party revolution with the contract with America swept the Republicans into power in both the House and Senate. More importantly, they did so with a much more conservative message as a reaction to what they perceived as Bill Clinton's liberal views. As a result, Boschwitz started calling Wellstone Senator Welfare and tried to pin the liberal tag on Wellstone while making himself look like a traditional conservative. But there was a third person in the race as well, and that was Dean Barkley of the Reform Party. Barkley used to be a Democrat and ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 1992 in Minnesota's 6th Congressional District. He would get 16.1% in that election, which led to the defeat of Democratic incumbent Jerry Sikorsky to Republican Rod Grams, who would run for the U.S. Senate and win 2 years later. Barkley also ran in that race, winning 5.4% of the vote. When it came to ideology, Barkley and Wellstone usually agreed on foreign policy and domestic issues, with the exception of fiscal issues in which Barkley was steadfastly conservative. Therefore, one might say that he took from both sides, much like Ross Perot did in 1992, which I already have done a video about. On February 12th, Wellstone officially launched his re-election campaign at the Landmark Center in St. Paul. But in the money race, the shoe was on the other foot this time. At the time of Wellstone's announcement, he had $2.3 million in his campaign war chest, while Boschwitz had $1.3 million. Still, this was a target for Republicans and a must-hold for Democrats. Early on, Boschwitz started running radio attack ads against Wellstone in March and not focusing on his primary opponents. For Wellstone, getting the party's endorsement was easy, but for Boschwitz, it wasn't panning out that way. In fact, going into the convention, Boschwitz wasn't even the favorite. That was Burt McCaskey, a state representative who had performed well at the congressional level party endorsement contests. On the first ballot, McCaskey had only 41%, but increased to 54% on the sixth ballot, still 6% short of the 60% required to receive the party's nomination. As for Boschwitz, he was climbing from 31% to 34%. The balloting would go on for the next day, in which after 14 ballots, the party did not endorse any candidate for the U.S. Senate. McCaskey was first on every ballot, but couldn't get the magical 60% needed for the endorsement. Even though there were no endorsements for the nomination, the primary was not even close. Boschwitz, having superior name recognition, dominated, winning 80.6% of the vote. In fact, McCaskey would finish third behind Stephen Young, a pro-choice political commentator and professor. Still, throughout the whole primary campaign, Boschwitz always acted like it was him versus Wellstone and rarely even acknowledged his primary challengers. Now, if you remember the last time, one of the things that killed Boschwitz in 1990 was his unwillingness to debate Wellstone. The 1996 election was no different. However, this time Boschwitz objected to Barkley being allowed into the debates, especially since Barkley was only polling at 2% in the most recent poll. This would exclude Boschwitz from a few debates, including the legal women's voter debate. Just one day later, Boschwitz changed his mind and decided to take part of the debates, even with Barkley being in them. In the first debate, which was just 2 days later, and a one-on-one against Wellstone, Boschwitz continued his attacks on Wellstone's liberal voting record, calling him embarrassingly liberal. In response, Wellstone called Boschwitz embarrassingly out of touch. Though Boschwitz changed his campaign tactics between the two elections, Wellstone was keeping with the same message that got him into the Senate in the first place, which was that Boschwitz was aloof when it came to the needs of the average Minnesotan. In the second debate, which was also between the two, both candidates attacked each other's campaign contributions, saying that each was in the pocket of special interest. In early October, another poll was conducted, this time by the Pioneer Press, KARE, Channel 11, and Minnesota Public Radio, showing Wellstone in the lead at 44% to Boschwitz's 40%, and Barkley now at 5%. But this poll was before Barkley's first debate appearance, which was on October 8th. Some political pundits said that Wellstone won, while others said that Barkley won. Regardless, the polls started to show Wellstone pulling ahead. In a Star Tribune WCCO TV poll released on October 15th, Wellstone was at 47% while Boschwitz was at 38%, which was outside the poll's 3.8% margin of error. And when it came to the endorsements, the newspapers were clearly on Wellstone's side. The St. Cloud Times, which enthusiastically endorsed Boschwitz 6 years before, flipped over to Wellstone, stating that Boschwitz had little to offer and, quote, has given little indication as to why he's running for a third term. The one idea he promoted, a 15% across-the-board tax cut, would be a financial disaster for the country, making it more difficult than ever to move toward balanced budgets, end of quote. And that was the main point. Boschowitz's campaign plan simply seemed to be focusing on calling Wellstone a liberal and nothing more. There was no substances campaign and really only a narrow vision message. Also, Wellstone didn't abandon his grassroots campaign and continued to go to small events in rural towns, while Boschwitz rarely did that and relied on mass media to reach out to voters. And with every debate appearance, Boschwitz being out of touch with the average voter became apparent. Also, the ads coming out on behalf of Boschwitz became extremely negative. In the last poll conducted before Election Day, which saw Wellstone up 50% to 37%, it also showed that Boschowitz's ads were actually helping Wellstone. On election night, Wellstone would win by nearly 200,000 votes, which totaled 50.3% of the overall vote. Boschwitz was second with only 41.3%, and Barkley finished third with 7%, which was a few percentage higher than many expected. And one last thing before we move on to 2002, and actually a good segue, is that Wikipedia says that Wellstone's eventual 2002 Republican opponent, Norm Coleman, supported Wellstone in 1996. In fact, it's the total opposite. In this article, dated on October 27, 1996, Coleman famously stayed out of the race and said that he disliked the progressives in the Democratic Party and actually refused to endorse Wellstone. In fact, a little more than a month later, Coleman left the Democratic Party and became a Republican. And with that, let's move over to Wellstone's 2002 Senate run. As mentioned earlier, Wellstone said that he would not run for a third term after winning in 1990. But on January 17, 2001, Wellstone announced that he would be seeking a third term as senator, citing the 50-50 split in the U.S. Senate. In a poll conducted after his announcement by Pioneer Press, 52% of Minnesotans approved of Wellstone running for a third term, with 42% opposing the idea. There were a few potential Republican candidates to take on Wellstone. One who was considered and even pushed to run by the White House was Minnesota House Majority Leader Tim Pawlenty. However, the White House eventually changed their mind and in April of 2001 pushed for St. Paul Mayor Norm Coleman, who eventually announced in April that he would be running for the U.S. Senate. Of course, Pawlenty would run for governor in 2002 and win in a three-way race. As mentioned before, Coleman had been a Democrat, but switched parties in December of 1996 with the support of many from Washington's Republican circles. At the start of his 2002 Senate campaign, Coleman raised over $600,000 in the first 8 weeks, showing, at least financially, that he was a formidable candidate against Wellstone, who had already raised over $1 million. Of course, the issues in this campaign were different than other campaigns. There was a new president, George W. Bush, as well as the issue of national security being prominent after the attacks on September 11, 2001. However, Coleman did pick up where Boschwitz left off, criticizing Wellstone for his spending and his support for social safety net programs. In the first poll released in 2002 by the Star Tribune, Wellstone was in another dead heat race for the Senate. In their poll, conducted February 2nd through 6th, Wellstone had 45% support to Coleman's 44%. Both men were equally liked by the electorate, though Wellstone had a higher disapproval rating. But unlike his first run in 1990, the electorate shifted. Now, younger voters, as well as those without college degrees, supported Wellstone, while higher income, college-educated voters went for Coleman. As for moderate voters, who would be the key to this race, Wellstone was winning 48% to 39%. A few days after the poll, Wellstone announced that he had a mild form of multiple sclerosis, which was causing the senator to limp as it affected his lower right leg. Luckily for Wellstone, Dr. J.D. Bartleson of the Mayo Clinic said that he didn't need any further treatment. The Republicans pledged to not make Wellstone's health an issue during the campaign, and they actually never did. Still, he wouldn't let his illness affect him. As with other campaigns, Wellstone continued to take his campaign on the road, relying more on a grassroots approach to campaigning than the media airwaves. In a poll conducted between June 20th and 24th, Wellstone was ahead of Coleman in this Star Tribune poll with 47% support to Coleman's 43%, well within the poll's 3.4 margin of error. Toward the end of the campaign, the ads were getting nasty, at least on the Coleman side, with the Republican National Committee ads showing Wellstone with a communist flag over his face. However, Wellstone was criticized for his online ads as well, with online media still being in its early stages. When visiting one of Wellstone's ad, when someone clicked on it, it would take them to a donation pledge form, which Wellstone's campaign was heavily criticized for. My, how times have changed. But even though the ads from the national parties might have been rough, the candidates were pretty cordial to one another and pretty calm, especially compared to previous elections. But as the campaign was in its closing weeks, Wellstone increased his lead in the Star Tribune poll, now up 47 to 41%, which was still within the margin of error, but almost outside of it. Unlike his 1990 campaign where he never led in any poll, this time he was never losing a poll. This poll was conducted between October 11th and October 16th. 5 days after the poll was released,
for me.
This is an ABC News special report.
Good afternoon, everybody. We interrupt your regular programming to tell you of a plane crash in northeastern Minnesota, where we have just had confirmed a short while ago 8 people were killed on a small beach aircraft that was on its way to Eveleth, Minnesota, including Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota. And according to the senior staff in the senator's office, not only the senator, but his wife Sheila, his daughter, 3 members of his staff, and the 2 pilots. Senator Wellstone was on his way from Minneapolis to Duluth. He had flown from Minneapolis to Eveleth to go to the funeral of a friend and was going to join his political campaign shortly thereafter. That he was with his wife Sheila, to whom he is very close. This is a senator who is unique in many ways, described by the magazine Mother Jones once as the first 1960s radical elected to the U.S. Senate. We have several reporters, not only who knew the senator, but who are trying very hard to confirm all of the details of this. But what we do now know, and we've had confirmed from the senator's staff, is that Senator Wellstone, his wife Sheila, his daughter, 3 members of his own staff, and 2 pilots were all on this beach aircraft that was trying to land at Eveleth, Minnesota in not altogether difficult but fairly dank weather circumstances, with a ceiling of about 700 feet and clouds at 400 feet. I'm going to go first to Minneapolis, to ABC News' John Cochran, who is on the phone with us there and was with Senator Wellstone a short while ago. John, what do you know?
Well, I know that his campaign staff here was hugging him, each other outside his campaign headquarters. Senator Ted Kennedy, Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, was here in the Twin Cities area to campaign for Senator Wellstone. Senator Wellstone was supposed to be with him this morning, but as you reported, the senator decided to go up to northern Minnesota to attend the funeral of the father of a friend of his. He was supposed to, as I say, be here this morning in Minneapolis, but changed his plans at almost the last minute.
all campaigning was suspended by Coleman, and the Democrats didn't know what to do as far as replacing Wellstone on the ballot. 2 days after the accident, David Wellstone, the late senator's son, Jeff Blodgett, Wellstone's campaign manager, and others met with Mondale to ask him to consider running for the position. But before Mondale made his decision on October 29th, a memorial service was held for Wellstone the day after his funeral and attended by 20,000 people. The Star Tribune would say, quote, "In a service that was alternately somber and celebratory, dignitaries and common folk alike gathered in remembrance," end of quote. However, for the Republicans, it was almost too celebratory, as they criticized it for looking more like a campaign rally. I mean, years later, that would really be the pot calling the kettle black. Anyway, on October 30th, the Star Tribune released another poll, this time with Walter Mondale as the DFL candidate. The poll showed Mondale with 47% support to Coleman at 39%, which was outside the margin of error. The next day, Mondale officially entered the race and Norm Coleman returned to the campaign trail. Now, a lot of people talk about how the memorial service hurt the Democrats, but it was probably more than that. First of all, absentee ballot rules had been eased in Minnesota, which in the early 2000s favored Republicans and not Democrats. Democrats wouldn't become the mail-in ballot party until 2020. Second, when it came to campaigning, both candidates took different approaches. In the last days, Mondale focused on having town hall meetings, which didn't really attract any press. As for Coleman, he was holding large public events in larger cities, which helped build public perception and momentum in his campaign. Another poll released just 2 days before the election showed Mondale still in the lead at 46%, with Coleman at 41%. Just like Wellstone in 1990, Coleman never led in a single poll, but the margin was narrowing. And finally, Mondale and Coleman had a debate on the day before the election. Interestingly, Mondale's approach to attacking Coleman was the same approach Boschwitz took when attacking Wellstone in 1996. Throughout most of the debate, Mondale called Coleman a right-winger, though most people considered Coleman either a centrist or right-of-center candidate. On election night, Norm Coleman would win the election by just over 2%, receiving 49.5% of the vote to Mondale's 47.3%. And with that, we have come to the end of today's video. I want to thank you all very much. If you liked this video, please press the like button, subscribe, and click the little bell so you're notified. Also, you can help out the channel by becoming a Patreon member. Thank you all very much, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now.